Welcome back. So today, we're going to build ourselves a bit of an analytical toolkit. The goal? To move way, way beyond that classic "the book was better" argument. And we're going to do that by diving into the brilliant ideas of some of the most important thinkers in adaptation studies. You've been there, right? That feeling of disappointment, maybe even anger, when a movie just doesn't get the book you loved. Well, the theorist Robert Stam absolutely nails it here. We use this incredibly strong, almost moral language. We talk about feeling betrayed or that the story has been violated. It's a really deep emotional reaction. But that feeling brings up a huge question, one that really gets to the core of what we're talking about today. Is faithfulness, or fidelity, really the best, or even the most useful way to judge an adaptation? Is that the only yardstick we should be using? To figure that out, here's our game plan. First, we're going to talk about something called the fidelity trap. Then, we'll pick up some super useful tools from theorists who help us separate the story from the telling, classify different kinds of adaptations, and even reframe the whole thing as a conversation. And finally, we'll take a peek at where the field is headed. Okay, so let's jump right in with that first big concept, the fidelity trap. This is that circular argument that so often shuts down a good conversation before it even has a chance to start. So what exactly is this trap? Well, Robert Stam calls the whole idea a chimera, basically an illusion, because when we demand a film be faithful, what do we actually mean? I mean, think about it. Should it be faithful to every single plot point, to the author's specific writing style? What about their original intent? Or maybe it's that fuzzy, hard-to-define spirit of the book. You see the problem, right? We can't even agree on what we're judging, so the whole debate just goes nowhere. So how do we get out of this trap? Well, our first tool comes from a theorist named Brian McFarlane, and it is a fantastic way to start thinking more clearly about what's actually going on when a story moves from the page to the screen. McFarlane gives us this really simple but incredibly powerful distinction. On one side, you have the narrative. That's the what of the story. You know, Harry Potter is about a young orphan who finds out he's a wizard and goes to a magical school. That core story, the characters, the plot points, that stuff is generally transferable. But then, on the other side, you have the enunciation. That's the how. In the book, the how is J.K. Rowling's prose, her descriptions. In the movie, the how is John Williams' iconic score. It's the specific camera angles during a wizard duel. It's Daniel Radcliffe's performance. Those things are totally specific to the medium. Just separating these two things lets us have a much, much smarter conversation. All right, let's add a couple more tools to our kit. These next ones are all about classifying and categorizing adaptations. And for that, we're going to turn to two giants in the field, Dudley Andrew and Linda Hutcheon. They offer different but really complementary ways of looking at things. Dudley Andrew says we can think about an adaptation's relationship to its source in three main ways. First, there's borrowing. A great example is the movie Clueless. It borrows the entire plot structure from Jane Austen's novel Emma, but creates something totally new and contemporary. Then there's intersecting, where a film might deliberately keep the bookness of the original in focus. And finally, there's transforming. This is probably the one we think of most often, the attempt to find a true cinematic equal to the literary work, like what Denis Villeneuve is trying to do with Dune. Okay, now let's switch our perspective a little. While Andrew is focused on what the adaptation is doing with the source, Linda Hutcheon asks us to look at the whole phenomenon of adaptation itself from a few different angles. She reminds us it's not just one thing. Hutcheon says we can look at an adaptation as a product. That's the finished movie we go see. We can also see it as a process, that whole creative journey of reinterpreting and recreating the story. And then, and this is so important, we can see it as an act of reception. That's about us, the audience. It's about how we experience the movie with the book still in our heads. It's like a palimpsest, where our memory of the novel is an invisible layer on top of the film we're watching. And that idea of layers brings us to our biggest and maybe most useful concept, and we're back with Robert Stam for this one. He wants us to completely change our central metaphor. Stop thinking of adaptation as a simple transfer, and start thinking of it as a dialogue. The big term here is intertextual dialogism. I know, it sounds super academic, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It just means that no story exists in a vacuum. Every text is woven from threads of other texts. So a film series like The Lord of the Rings isn't just talking to Tolkien's book, it's also in conversation with the entire history of fantasy movies that came before it, the cultural moment it was made in, the new possibilities of CGI technology. It's a new voice joining a huge ongoing conversation. This quote really just says it all perfectly. Stam calls it an ongoing dialogical process. The film is talking back to the book. It's reinterpreting it, maybe even challenging it. And this view completely frees us from the fidelity trap, doesn't it? Because if the goal is conversation, not copying, then the whole idea of infidelity just doesn't make sense anymore. So now that we have this fantastic new toolkit, where does the field of adaptation studies go from here? Well, these big ideas have really blown the doors open for new ways of thinking. Yeah, the conversation is always moving forward. You've got brilliant contemporary scholars like Camilla Elliott who are looking at the history of how we've even thought about adaptation. And then there are thinkers like Christine Geragati who are pushing us to look beyond the source text altogether. And this is the final thought I want to leave you with, because it's a real mind-bender in the best possible way. Christine Geragati suggests that maybe, after all is said and done, the most important thing about a film like The Godfather or Blade Runner isn't that it came from a book. What if its real genius, its most important contribution, is what it is as a piece of cinema, completely on its own terms? It's a pretty radical idea to chew on the next time you find yourself in that book versus movie debate.